Are you seeking fulfillment for your life? Do you want freedom from fear? That's why we're here. Welcome to Jesus 101, introducing you to the real Jesus. And now, here's your host, Elizabeth Talbot.
Welcome to Jesus 101. I'm Elizabeth Talbot, and today we are talking about bread. That's why I'm holding bread. Well, of course, the bread that we're going to talk about was unleavened bread and perhaps looked pretty much like this. And it has to do with feeding bread to thousands of people. But, this actually is recorded in Matthew chapter 14. But I'm going to use Mark instead today, simply because he makes some few extra comments that I would like to share with you today. So we're going to do it from the Gospel of Mark. We're going to actually write a lot today. So if you want to go get a paper and a pen and your Bible, we're going to be in Mark chapter 6 all the way to chapter 8. And we're going to do this in 3 segments so that you don't miss the beauty of this narrative. Well, the Gospel of Mark is the only one that calls his gospel the gospel. So Mark chapter 1 verse 1 says this is the beginning of the gospel. Gospel means good news. And maybe you could hear some good news today, huh? Maybe you're going through something that you really need to hear good news. Well, Mark's audience was going through a lot of trouble. They needed to hear good news. They were suffering. Half of the Gospel of Mark, the later half, is actually about Jesus' death. So he devotes half of his gospel to Jesus' suffering. And he has to tell people good news. And part of the good news is that, the gospel is for more than one group of people. It's for anyone that wants it. And he's going to use the symbol of bread to do that. So let's go to chapter 6. One day, I do these things. I was counting how many occurrences of the word bread, artos in Greek, there are here in the Gospel of Mark. And I found that there are 22 occurrences of the word bread, but that 19 of them are in these 3 chapters. That there is this cluster of bread that Mark is going to use to teach us something very important. And maybe when we're done, we will all have learned a valuable lesson. See, I was very, very challenged by these 3 chapters that I'm going to share with you in these 3 segments. Let's start on chapter 6 of Mark. We get the feeding of the 5,000. 5,000 men, plus women and children. So the truth is, there are a lot more people than 5,000, but we are told about 5,000. This first story has numbers that define the Jews. We are actually in the map in Jewish territory. So think about this. We're going to have a story of feeding, and then in chapter 8, we're going to have another story of feeding. And then here, we're going to have a breakthrough where Mark wants to say that there is bread, not just for the Jews, but for the people on the other side of the lake, the ones that were not Jews. So let's go to the first story. See, numbers were very important in that particular culture because they defined groups. Number 5, remember, it was very important for the Jews because Moses had done the Torah and there were 5 books. Aside from that, 12 was very important because of the 12 tribes. So we're not surprised to find these numbers in this account. Let's start reading on chapter 6 of Mark. Verse 35, when it was already quite late, his disciples came to him and said, "This place is desolate and is already quite late. Send them away." And Jesus said, "No, you give them something to eat." And they said, "Well, where are we going to get all this money to be able to feed all these people?" And this is where we get some numbers. And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go look." And when they said, "Well, 5. We found 5. He said, "Well, that's enough." He commanded them all to sit down by groups on the green grass. And interesting, verse 40 says they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s. If you remember Israel's history, that's the way that they used to be sitting in the desert when Moses was in charge. And he did 4 things. He took the bread And he took the 5 loaves. It's repeated again so that we don't miss that we're dealing with number 5. He took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looked up to heaven. He did 4 things. He blessed it. He broke it. And he also gave it to the disciples. So he took it, he blessed it, he broke it, and he gave it to the disciples. And we are told that they all ate and were satisfied. Of course, this is going to be a very key word here for us, satisfied. And then we are told that they picked up 12 baskets full. And we are then going to be told that there were 5,000 men. See, we have a lot of 5s and 12s in this story because groups at that time were defined by numbers. As a matter of fact, we even get a particular word for basket. The word for basket in this particular account is kophinoi. Kophinoi was a small basket that was used by the Jews. So when Jesus says that there are 12 baskets, it says kophinoi, so that you may know that we are in Jewish territory. Well, perhaps you've never been an insider where you're at, and someday you would like to know that there is enough for you. Many times I have told people, we can celebrate our heritage. We all have numbers in our groups. We know who we belong to. We know how many doctrines we have. And heritage and numbers are very important, and we should celebrate them. Unless we use our numbers to put other people down. Because see, they had their identity, but in order to have their identity, they denied everybody else their identity. And the truth is, you can have your identity and allow other people to have theirs. Now, this story is going to get very interesting because Mark is going to challenge the people that are reading his gospel, that there is bread for more than just the people on this side of the lake, that there is more than just for a particular group of people, that there's more than just for a particular social, religious, political group, that Jesus had come for everyone. There's something about human nature that we want to know that, well, yeah, we're in. But about those people, I don't know about them. But perhaps you were one of those people out there that people always pointed to and say, well, that person is not dressed properly. They don't look right. They're not in. There's whole articles in magazines. Who's in and who's out? Well, Mark is trying to tell us that really everyone is in. But he hasn't done it yet. He will do it in the next section of his narrative. For now, I want you to remember one thing. Jesus is the bread that came down from heaven. He is the real bread of life. And Mark is trying to teach us something very good when he says the gospel of Jesus Christ. He's about to tell us that the scope of Jesus' ministry is so large and is so great that it includes everyone, even the ones that the Jews thought it shouldn't include. Isn't that good news? Because Jesus' sacrifice on the cross includes even me. And I probably wouldn't qualify as an insider many times. Maybe neither would you. And yet, Jesus' sacrifice is large enough for everyone.
You're watching Jesus 101.
Welcome to Jesus 101. We're talking about bread. And now I am actually holding a basket of bread that will help us to understand the rest of the story of Mark. See, in our previous segment, we talked about the fact that the Jews, they knew they had the bread. And Jesus is giving them bread. 5,000 people, 5 loaves of bread. And the word for basket is kophinoi in that story in Mark chapter 6, because this was the type of basket that the Jews used to use, a small basket. Well, Mark wants to say, look, there is more bread. Not just the 12 tribes. They can be satisfied. But there's more than that. The scope of Jesus' ministry is greater than that. But he has to break those news because those are hard news. When we believe that we are the only ones, those are hard news. And so he does a segment in between. Remember, we just did the 5,000? Jesus has fed the 5,000, and we get all these numbers, and numbers actually defined this group. 12 tribes, 5 books of the law. Now, what Mark is going to do, he is going to put an event in the middle that will be the breakthrough. Now, let's continue. This is going to get so exciting. I can't wait to tell you. In chapter 7, Pharisees come to Jesus and they start talking about bread. Of course, remember, 19 of the 22 occurrences of bread are right here in these 3 chapters in the whole Gospel of Mark. And so they start talking about bread, and they start by saying, how come your disciples eat bread with unclean hands? And Jesus engages in a discourse to explain really what is really unclean. Really, what is unclean? And he says, well, if we're going to talk about morally unclean, is what comes from inside a person that really is unclean. All the bad thoughts and the bad wishes and all the thoughts about things that we don't tell anyone. And after he's done with those discourses, he actually crosses to unclean territory. And this is going to be our breakthrough event, our breakthrough right here. And this is chapter 7, verse 24. He goes to Tyre and Sidon. Remember that bad, unclean place where Jezebel was from? Remember Jezebel, the queen that led all of Israel astray to worship the wrong god? Let's read it, verse 24. Jesus got up and went away from there to the region of Tyre. And when he had entered a house, he wanted no one to know it, but he could not escape notice. After hearing of him, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately came and fell at his feet. And the woman was a Gentile of the Syrophoenician race. This is what we call a crescendo of demerit. She's a woman. She's a Greek, a Gentile of the Syrophoenician race. I mean, how bad can it get? Have you ever felt like that? That people are looking at you and says, yeah, well, he's a, you know what, but not only that, he's also this. In my case, I'm in the ministry and I'm a Latino woman. Sometimes it feels like a crescendo of demerit to some people. And so here we have the woman was a Gentile of the Syrophoenician race. And she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And then they're going to engage in this riddle about bread. So here it goes. He was saying to her, let the children be satisfied first. Well, of course, that's what Mark has done. He has fed the 5,000 people right now. And we're again talking about being satisfied. Now, don't forget that all the 12 tribes were satisfied because they had 12 baskets left. So Jesus says, but the bread, well, the children are supposed to get the bread and be satisfied. Let's read it. Let the children be satisfied first. It is not good to take the children's bread and give it to the dogs on the other side of the lake. Well, the woman says, that's okay. They can have their bread first. It's okay, Jesus. But, she says, and answers in the same manner. Yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table can feed on the children's crumbs. See, you have plenty of bread for them to be satisfied. Maybe there's a little bit of bread for us on this other side of the lake to also be satisfied. Well, the children can be satisfied first. It's okay, Jesus. But how about a few crumbs for us? Oh, says Jesus, somebody gets it. Somebody gets it. And you know what you find in the next chapter, chapter 8? Well, this time you find 4,000 people being fed on the other side of the lake. 4,000 4 is always the number for universal because of the 4 cardinal points. In the Bible, 4 is also always the whole world. But this time, the loaves are 7. There are 7 loaves. And you might want to say, well, what does 7 have to do with the people on the other side of the lake? Well, what happens is that there were 7 nations that were actually displaced by by Israel when they came to the promised land. Let me take you really quick to the book of Acts. And you can see in chapter 13, verse 19, it says, when they had destroyed the 7 nations in the land of Canaan, then he distributed their land as an inheritance. This is the way it happened. So 7 was the amount of people, the amount of nations that actually lived there. So in this story, there are 7 loaves, and guess what? 7 baskets left. Now, the word for baskets has changed because now we're talking about the name that Greeks would give, spurides or spirides. See, these baskets look different than these baskets. It's a whole different name for baskets. And guess what? At the end of this story, we have that they all ate and were satisfied. So he's working with some key words here. And the key words are very important because we're about to break through. Mark is about to tell us that, can you believe it? There is enough bread for this basket, the Jewish basket, the kophinos, with 12 loaves, but there's also enough bread for the other ones on the other side of the lake with the 7 baskets, because there were 7 pagan nations. And what a difficult thing to teach somebody, that they can keep their identity and celebrate it. But whether you're carrying your bread on 12 baskets, 7 baskets, or 28 baskets, well, there's enough bread for everyone. And this is hard to understand sometimes. And Mark is trying to break those good news, that there is actually bread for everyone. And everyone, my friend, includes you.
You're watching Jesus 101.
Welcome back to Jesus 101. Well, we've been reading 2 feeding stories where Jesus actually feeds bread first to the Jews. And the numbers are 12 and 5 because we are in Jewish territory. And they have a special type of basket called kophinos. And the kophino is a small basket that the Jews used to use. And there are 12 baskets left. Of course, we have 12 tribes. And Jesus started with 5 loaves of bread, 5 being a big number for the Jews. Well, as we go along in the narrative, Jesus finds a Syrophoenician woman who would have never been considered an insider. And he says to her, well, it's not right for me to give the bread of the children to the dogs. Of course, you know, that's how far the Gentiles were considered in the scale of purity. Well, the woman says, the children can have their bread first, and they can be satisfied, that's okay. But maybe you can have some crumbs that fall from the table. So the next narrative in Mark chapter 8 finds Jesus feeding the 4,000. Now remember, 4 is the universal number of 4 points, north, south, east, west. And they have 7 loaves of bread, and 7, of course, were the 7 nations that were displaced from Canaan, and you can read about this in Acts chapter 13. Well, we changed the name for baskets in that one because the Greeks used these large baskets. Now, just in case somebody missed it, somebody missed the breakthrough, Jesus is going to summarize it for them in the Gospel of Mark. And Mark makes a point to record all this, saying that there is a very important meaning in the type of baskets and in the type of bread, how many we have. So let's read it. So after all of this is over, Jesus is going to summarize it, okay? Ready? Chapter 8. Verse 18. Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets, kophinoi, full of broken pieces you picked up? They said to him, 12. Okay, says Jesus. And when I broke the 7 for the 4,000, well, how many large baskets, spurides, full of broken pieces did you pick up? And they said, well, 7. And he was saying to them, do you not yet understand? Do we not yet understand that we can celebrate our identity and our heritage and be satisfied with the bread and allow other people their identity and their heritage, and they can also be satisfied? There is enough bread for everyone. And this is the breakthrough that Mark is bringing to his audience. But of course, so far we're speaking in riddles. All we know is that Jesus took the bread and blessed the bread and broke the bread and gave it to the disciples. Well, he did the same thing. He took the bread and he gave thanksgiving for the bread, and he broke the bread and gave it to his disciples. But so far we don't know what that means. Well, Mark wants to make sure we do get to know what that means. At the very end of the gospel, this is going to be the moment in which the riddle is actually revealed. Because so far, we don't know what the bread is. So I'm going to pick it up on chapter 14 of Mark, verse 22. While they were eating, he took some bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it. Oh, hold on. We have the same 4 verbs that we had here? You mean Jesus, by now the hearers, when they heard this gospel read, and the readers, when they read the gospel, they have seen Jesus do these 4 verbs already. Remember in the feeding of the 5,000? So let's read it again. Chapter 14, verse 22. While they were eating, he took some bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, and he gave it to them, and revealed the riddle. He said, "Take, this is my body, which is broken for you. Yes, for you, 12 tribes. Yes, for you, 7 nations. And whatever number it might be that you belong to. I belong to one that has 28 baskets." Well, what we need to make sure is that our baskets are carrying the broken body of Jesus. Because this is what it was all about. It was about taking the broken body of Jesus everywhere. Now, don't forget that Peter, right after this, will say, "Well, thank you for your offer, Jesus. Thank you, but I don't really need it because I'm pretty good." So he will say after this, "Even if I have to die with you, nothing's going to happen to me. So you can rest at peace. You can be okay, Jesus." Well, you know this story. He will deny the Lord after the Lord has made a covenant through his broken body with him. Only in the Gospel of Mark on chapter 16, only there in resurrection morning. This is so incredible. Chapter 16, verse 5. Entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting at the right, wearing a white robe, and they were amazed. And he said to them, "Do not be amazed. You're looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who had been crucified. He has risen. He's not here. Behold, here's the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter." He mentions Peter by name. He mentions the one that have failed him by name. No matter what group Peter belonged to, maybe, of course, he belonged to the 12 baskets because he came from that group. But Jesus says to the angel, "Make sure you actually utter Peter's name because Peter's not going to go to Galilee." He wasn't going to go because he had failed. See, by this point, Mark has proven to us that there is enough bread for this group and this group, for the 12 tribes and for the 7 pagan nations. He has always told us that, well, actually, we didn't know what the riddle meant because we didn't realize that the bread was symbolizing, well, the broken body of Jesus, because the truth is, Jesus is the true bread that came down from heaven. And throughout this narrative, Mark has tried desperately to tell us that there is bread for everyone. And even if you were not part of a particular group, well, God was reaching out to you, whether you were of the 12, of the 7, of the 28, or whatever other group you belong to. That the point was that Jesus had died and his broken body was enough for you to be satisfied and have leftovers. So this is my message for you today. May the bread of satisfaction be yours today.